The sound of the bell. It's beautiful. So when we hear that sound, the sound of the bell, we remember to stop, calm, find a breath, and be aware in the present moment. Whenever we hear the sound, we do that. And so over time, we are conditioned. There's this conditioned response to hearing the sound of the bell. When we practice with action, intentional action, over time, we're able to create habit energies. And we can transform habit energies. So I ring the bell for people in videos frequently for that reason, because I think it's a useful practice. But it's also really relevant right now because we've been reading about habit energy. We've been learning about the mind system, how the mind works. Learning about the roots, the soil of the mind, the storehouse consciousness, alaya vijnana. That is like a field full of seeds. And in some of the first verses that we looked at, we learned that we can think of it as a field full of seeds, but we can also think of it as just the total collection of seeds. And that point was made, and it's kind of subtle and interesting. But these seeds are potentialities. And there are every kind of seed in the field of mind, every potential manifestation exists as a seed in that soil. There's a seed that if you nourish it, it grows and eventually manifests as Buddhahood. Sometimes the seed of Buddha manifests in the outside world. We meet a Buddha or we hear about a Buddha. But sometimes beings become Buddha. They wake up. And this is the result of activating a very special set of seeds in that field. And we can think of it like we're farmers. We're farmers working the field of mind. And our regions of the field, the different regions of the field that we all cultivate, overlap in interesting ways. We've inherited these regions of this field from our ancestors and from our own past actions in this life and in past lives. So we can think of that as a kind of vertical transmission over time. But there's also a horizontal transmission of seeds. Our actions now touch the seeds in the minds of those who are touched by our actions. So when we scream at someone and call them names and say horrible things, we are nourishing painful seeds, not only for them, but for ourselves. And this is a point that Thich Nhat Hanh brought attention to a few times so far in this book. All these seeds and all their manifestations are both collective and individual. Always. So these notions, collective, individual, these are in Buddhism called signs. And we learned from Thich Nhat Hanh that there are these three categories of signs. So seeds grow up and they manifest as fruits in conscious awareness. When they manifest according to signs, as signs. There is one set of characteristics the Buddha taught about signs, which is universal versus particular. And that category, the Buddha taught us to identify it and recognize it when it appears. But it's what we're talking about here with this soil mind and these seeds and their manifestation. It's the sign appears as like, I did this to myself. You know, the notion that this sequence of events is a result of my action, that's the individual aspect of that sign. And it's valid. You know, I play a role. I do act. Actions have results. Some of the actions it makes sense to say that I did do those things. So the sign, the appearance, reality, yes, it looks like I did the action. But ultimately, when we look at why I acted the way I acted, we can't ignore the whole field of activity of this mind system. Because ultimately, I am not a separate, permanent self. I'm a confluence. All these different streams running together, manifesting as this body and this mano, vijnana, intellect, mind. So every appearance has individual characteristics, signs, universal signs, universal aspects to the signs. So that I do act, and those actions have results, and I'm responsible for what happens. But also, I act in a bigger context. I'm a part of a bigger organism. My actions are what they are because this environment is what it is. So, this is conventional reality. In Buddhist teaching, we have these two truths. There's relative truth, conventional, you know, this truth, the truth where words and thoughts make sense. That's conventional reality. And then there's ultimate reality, which is what a Buddha sees, which is not within the grasp of dualistic discrimination. But there are still things that can be known about ultimate truths. The thoughts themselves just cannot grasp the ultimate truths. But they can point to ultimate truth, and ultimate truth can be directly, experientially understood. So, the appearance, reality, all this stuff we see in front of us, that's conventional reality. That's where it makes sense to say things have this individual aspect. My action is my action, your action is your action. And looking deeper into conventional reality, we can't deny that there are also bigger, forces at work for us, making our individual action what it is. This is still conventional reality. This is still the dualistic realm. But now we see there's a collective aspect to our action as well as an individual action or aspect. So they're still conventional reality. And then we take another step and realize not self. And realize that neither collective nor individual are ultimately absolutely true. The absolute truth is beyond, but beyond, and further beyond thoughts and words. And that is a bunch of context, so you might understand why this kind of teaching is important to me. And now I'll start reading Thich Nhat Hanh. He's been talking about changing habits. They're perceptual habits. We habitually think reality is what we think it is. And sometimes it goes unquestioned, unexamined. It's habit energy. But there are other habits too. Action habits. They can be transformed. Once mindfulness is there and they've been identified, they can transform. All conditioned things are impermanent. So it's really wonderful news. He was saying, Thich Nhat Hanh was telling us this is good news. We can do the work and we can transform ourselves and thereby transform the world. And we should do such things because it matters. Because suffering is painful. We know that. We don't want to cause suffering for others. So we confront the causes of suffering inside. Perceptual habits, bad habits of speech, bad habits of thinking, bad habits of physically doing. Those are the 3 gateways of karma. With mindfulness, we watch, we see what happens, and we abandon unwholesome actions. We continually abstain from unwholesome actions, which really means harmful actions. And here, the Buddha is not talking about an absolute good and evil. It's a contextual good and evil. The word that we translate as wholesome or skillful is kusala. It's like a profitable action. It's a contextual thing. So a bodhisattva is born into the world and pays attention to what's happening and why, what kinds of actions produce what kinds of results. And with this special kind of discrimination or discernment, she changes her behavior to address the causes of suffering she sees. And she doesn't need to believe that this is absolutely evil or this is absolutely good. And she doesn't even need to believe that the good or the bad have anything to do with any kind of God or any kind of belief. She has seen. She's seen that this action leads to pain for self and others. And this is the heart of Buddhism, ending suffering. Early Buddhism, it focused on liberating beings from suffering, both self and other, and it's beautiful and wonderful. And then later, Mahayana Buddhism happened, and it has a specific emphasis. It's on the bodhisattva. And this is what a Buddha is called before a Buddha is a Buddha. A bodhisattva, an enlightening being. So, Mahayana Buddhism is the bodhisattva path. The bodhisattva has bodhicitta. And this is the mind that strives for Buddhahood to liberate all beings from suffering forever most effectively. So these bodhisattvas, they keep going. They perfect every practice. They fully engage with the realm produced by dualistic discrimination. They look like worldly beings sometimes, like great business people sometimes. They take all sorts of forms to meet suffering in the ways in which beings are actually suffering. So they are born into a world and pay attention and then confront suffering according to the path of the Buddhas. So Thich Nhat Hanh comes from this Mahayana Buddhist stream, but he's special. Vietnamese Buddhism is special because there's strong Mahayana and Theravada Buddhist streams there. And they're both useful and beautiful streams, even though those who don't fully understand them will argue and bicker and say that one path is superior and the other is inferior. But really, the heroes of the two traditions, if you look at what they're saying the same kinds of things. So, more background on the world of Buddhism and how Thich Nhat Hanh fits in, and Vietnamese Buddhism in general. It's a strange history, and it's full of suffering. You know, the USA went to warring with the Vietnamese people. And in response, what happened? You know, Thich Nhat Hanh came here to teach us how to stop being so greedy, hateful, and confused. When he first came here, he came like swinging. That book, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, he's very direct and firm, almost harsh sometimes. But it makes sense. Looking at the historical context, he saw his people being brutalized by these Americans after, you know, a long period of colonialism with the French. So we Europeans have a lot to learn, and Thich Nhat Hanh did a lot to teach us. So as I read his teachings, I just try to highlight why I think it's so beautiful. He's teaching us how to do what he wishes we would do. Transform our habit energy. At first, conscious breathing requires effort. However, if we continue to practice, conscious breathing will become a habit energy. We form any new habit in the same way. When you first begin brushing your teeth after meals, you might forget sometimes. So you want to brush your teeth after every meal, and so you set out to make that a new habit, but you might forget. After a while, if you keep trying, it becomes a habit. And then not brushing is uncomfortable. So we can look at this in terms of the Four Noble Truths too. So the Buddha brought all his focus to suffering, to the causes of suffering, and the end of suffering, and the way to the end of suffering. When people wanted to argue with him about, metaphysical or theological speculation, he would just not answer them. And when he did say something to them, he would say, "This doesn't have anything to do with the end of suffering." And so he would just not engage in that kind of conversation. When we see suffering, when we fully acknowledge for it as it is, that will produce like a revulsion to the causes of suffering. They will look unpleasant and ugly. And the trick the Buddha encourages us to do is to not let that kind of revulsion turn into simple aversion to the world, but to use that revulsion as a source of energy for compassion, karuna, and love, maitri, and sympathetic joy, which is mudita. And when you see other beings thriving happily, you are happy. And we use this revulsion, our sense of dissatisfaction with the ways of the world and the pleasures offered by the world. We use that unpleasant feeling to drive continual activity. And the Bodhisattva, as I was saying earlier, with Mahayana Buddhism, the whole point is to liberate all other beings. Earlier Buddhism was not so focused on the liberation of all other beings. But when you do that, when you make your goal the liberation of all other beings, it's like your practice becomes a confrontation of suffering in the world, and so societies benefit. Societies transform and become more compassionate because the beings there are on the bodhisattva path, confronting suffering and the causes of suffering, so they can realize the end of suffering and the way to the end of suffering. So all of that rambling I just did emerged from my thought after reading Thich Nhat Hanh talking about changing our habits. I was thinking, well, why do people care to change their habits in the first place? Why should they care? How can they be taught to care? And then immediately I thought of the Four Noble Truths. And that's why changing habits should matter. Because there is suffering, and there are causes of suffering. There is the end of suffering, and there's a way to the end of suffering. We should work to do our part to reduce suffering and increase happiness. And that's a big part of the Bodhisattva path. And Thich Nhat Hanh is a teacher on that path, in that stream. So it makes sense for one who likes Thich Nhat Hanh to look around at the bigger world of Buddhism. It will help you to see why Thich Nhat Hanh is special. And now I'm done talking about that point. And I see there's a hawk in that tree over there. Most excellent. Sometimes there are 2 ravens that come to this swamp. And I've lived here a long time. I don't usually see ravens in town. But when I'm out here, I started seeing these ravens, and I can hear that they're not crows because their croak is deep and strange. And they just come hang out in the swamp, and I look at them and listen to their strange croak. This is a pure land. All the objects are associated with the practice of mindfulness and concentration and insight, just like the Pure Lands described in the Buddhist texts. So here we go. We know we should transform our addictions, our habit energies, because suffering matters, and we do play a role in creating suffering in the world. And we don't want to. So we want to change our habits and remove our addictions. But Thich Nhat Hanh says, some habit energies are very difficult to transform. And me personally, I know. I have been addicted to the gnarliest of drugs. And I've quit. And it's been many years. And it was Thich Nhat Hanh and the Buddha who showed me the way. I did not do well in treatment programs or AA. I always had unpleasant, unhelpful experiences there. It wasn't until I made, studied and understood the Buddha and then made friends with a Vietnamese monk and became a part of that community. It's like replacing my old addictions with new wholesome pleasures like Buddhism. It was essential to have that thing, that extra thing. The community and the teachings and the Buddha. Just remembering the Buddha, that's a specific kind of meditation. It brings inspiration and happiness, brightness. It's called Buddha Nusati, and it means, mindfulness of the Buddha. But yeah, even that practice alone is pleasant. There are wholesome pleasures that can be there for those who are working to destroy their addictions. Buddhism has a lot of them. And meditation has a lot to do with those wholesome, higher happinesses. Now let's see what Thich Nhat Hanh has to say about it. Smoking is a habit energy that is hard to give up. Mindfulness is the key. Whenever we are smoking, we practice mindfulness in order to know that we are smoking. Our mindfulness of this habit energy will grow deeper every day, and we will see that we are destroying our lungs. And it's funny that he brings up mindfulness right away, because when I was trying to not be addicted to pills and heroin, I found myself, asking a community of yogis that I had stumbled across. I told them, I'm very addicted to opioids. How do I not be addicted to these drugs? I was seriously wanting to hear if anybody with this perspective, which was similar to mine, more so than Western models of the mind. The Eastern models make more sense. So I was asking those communities for help. And they gave me the best answer. They weren't Buddhists, but they gave the same answer that Thich Nhat Hanh just gave. Mindfulness is the key. And for me, when I look at the Western models of addiction treatment, I see they are only succeeding in cultivating aversion into people who use drugs. Aversion's not the way. Aversion's a big part of the addictive process. People do drugs and they have these forms of aversion and they think that they are horrible people because others have aversion toward them for being what they are. But really, if they would just drop the cultivation of self-hatred, aversion to drugs, and instead cultivate mindfulness, just be aware. Watch what you do. Be aware. Why are you doing what you're doing? Over time, you see more clearly what is truly happening with that process. You become heedful instead of heedless, where you don't see what it actually does when you get high and what it actually feels like to chase the drug. It's unpleasant. It's a bunch of work and it's always annoying. And then there's like a short span of almost good feelings. But as you get deeper and deeper into the drugs, there are just less and less good feelings in general. And you can't experience pleasure. And even when you do lots of the drug, because your mind system's all stretched out and lopsided, you just don't take delight in normal activities in the world. And then you start thinking, I'm the worst person, blah, blah, blah. And you cultivate all this aversion. And life just looks more ugly. But then a group of yogis tells you, hey, just be mindful. And then you start being aware of what you're actually doing. And you can see with your own direct experiential understanding, like, this is a waste of time. What am I doing? I'm just trying to be happy. But this is not happiness. Once you clearly see that for yourself, everything is different. But then again, not everyone is like me. And I recognize that. Some people do seem to benefit from these Western models. I think it's craziness, but I'm not trying to get in the way of people's health, so I don't really care. But when people come at me like I'm supposed to act the way they think people are supposed to act, I'm not going to tolerate that. I don't need to go to AA. I do not benefit from that. But many people in that world think everyone needs it, and it's the only way. And really, anybody that's had any experience with it will know what I'm talking about. This is difficult stuff, confronting addiction. The USA has been a long celebration of greed, genocide, horrible things. There's also been good things, but the greed has been there. We all have these addictions. We've been engaged in this process, our ancestors and our peers. So we're not horrible people or anything. We have just developed unwholesome habit energies. Drinking is another habit energy. Perhaps every time we feel sad, we drink a glass of wine in order to forget our sadness. And this is very common. With mindfulness, each time we raise our glass, we say, I know that I am drinking a glass of wine. When our mindfulness is stronger, we will be able to say, I know that I am sad. When we drink the wine, energy of drinking wine, we will be able to begin to transform the seeds of sadness in ourselves. So, you see, the way Tai is describing this, it takes work to even be able to acknowledge this as suffering. And I know exactly what he's talking about. And drinking, particularly because our culture has all this habit energy around drinking. We've been drinking as a way of relieving stress for a long time. So it's normal. When things become normal, they're difficult to identify as suffering or the causes of suffering. So we have to be careful with what we let become normal. And it took me a long time to stop drinking completely. I never really had a huge problem with alcohol, though. I didn't really enjoy it. I wanted stronger sedatives. And so then I just didn't treat it seriously for a long time. And I kept drinking like a couple beers every day for years. And then I finally was like, what am I doing? This is a waste of time, money, and health, happiness. I was always kind of thrown off balance, but it has been so normalized here, at least in my social sphere, that it was difficult for me to acknowledge that it was suffering and the causes of suffering. But I saw very clearly that it was horrible. There was a manifestation, painful manifestation of drunkenness that happened in life, and I was very sad. And I realized that my drinking is not just my drinking. When I drink, I am promoting, drinking. And those around me are reminded of drinking. Some of those people have troubles with drinking that I don't have. But I need to be, like, if I love these people, I need to be fully aware of how I promote actions. And drinking does promote drinking. And drinking also very often produces very gnarly suffering. And it's hard to identify because it's so normal. This is a thing I talk a lot about with my friends here when I wander around at this swamp. Many of my generation or whatever, my friends, we've all struggled with opioids and other gnarly drugs. I think about high school. And in high school, I was like a drug guy. I hung out with people that were on drugs. And I was connected to pretty much all of the groups of the social realm through drugs. And I was just always high. And then there were people who were like popular and involved in sports. And they also did drugs, but that wasn't their main deal. And I remember being really surprised in like my 20s to find that many of these people who were healthy and happy in high school, but kind of doing drugs. Later, after they started working and making money, they got very addicted to pills like OxyContin. Horrible things happened to them. Many of them. Some of them, live as if they're dead now. Some of them seem to have lost their minds. Many of them are dead. And some of them figured it out and abandoned their addictions. And they're still alive. I keep reading this understanding our mind, and Thich Nhat Hanh's talking about addictions and removing addictions. And that is a huge thing for our time. I keep thinking about my friends that I've lost. So, let's remove our addictions. Because happiness can also be a habit energy. When we practice walking meditation, every step we take brings us peace and joy. And right now I'm practicing walking meditation along with talking and reading meditation. Whenever we do anything with awareness, we have meditation. So when we practice walking meditation, already said that. When we first begin to practice walking meditation, we may have to make an effort. We are not yet skilled at it. But one day, we begin to feel peace and joy quite naturally. We wonder, why was I always in such a hurry? Once we feel at ease with walking meditation and other ways of moving mindfully, they become a wholesome habit. So here, Thai used the word wholesome. We have wholesome habits. We have wholesome desires. There are wholesome pleasures. There are also unwholesome desires, habits, actions, and pleasures. Though there are positive habit energies, it seems that negative habits are established more quickly, more easily than positive ones. And whenever I'm thinking of this, I think about how long it takes for a beautiful forest to grow. It takes a long time, a lot of energy, a lot of organization. But then you light it up on fire and it's all burnt down in a couple hours. I think the mind is like that. It takes a long time to develop a good, wholesome momentum. But it can be lost very easily. And so, every action is the most important action. Because any action can burn up the forest of wholesome qualities. At school, our children are exposed to both good and bad habits. But they seem to learn the bad ones right away. It takes time for a young person to learn to appreciate Shakespeare, but it doesn't take long at all to learn to drink alcohol. When you teach something to a child, you may have to repeat it again and again, so that the seed will be planted solidly in the child's consciousness. When you paint a wall, the first coat is not enough. You'll have to paint over it a second and a third time. This is how we learn. And this is conditioning. We know about conditioning. There was that guy Pavlov, and he had dogs who were trained, who were conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell. We learn through conditioning. We can take control of our conditioning. We can build habits, and we can take habits apart. We have to recognize, embrace, and transform our negative habit energies and train ourselves to have more positive habit energies. I was fortunate that early in my life I learned the good habit of practicing sitting meditation every day to calm myself and to cultivate more stability, solidity, and freedom. Many of us now have learned the habit of returning to our breathing and smiling every time we hear the bell of mindfulness. These positive habits need to be cultivated because our negative habits always push us to do and say things that bring suffering to ourselves and others. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow, and we will continue to talk about the mind system, how it works, and how we can make it work for us. Hope you have the best day. Bye-bye.